Good morning. How are you today, Farzana? Thank you for joining me today.
Good morning, Anisha. Very well and very happy to be speaking to you. Thank you so much for having me on.
Fantastic. So, as you know, my podcast is called Naughty Bites. The one question I do have to ask you is, when you get home from work, what is your guilty pleasure?
Oh, I've got many guilty pleasures. But my favorite is, and I'll show you right now, I love chocolate.
Oh,
I,
wait. Oh, that's amazing.
yeah, I like Maltesers, Twix, Mars, peanut M&Ms, Twirl.
Oh.
People send me really posh chocolates, and my heart sinks because I just love cheap chocolate.
But I have to ask you because have you tried the Twirl Orange, the limited edition?
No, I'll try that though, because actually chocolate and orange is just an amazing mix.
No,
Um,
definitely.
okay.
Do try that. And my last question is, how do you eat your Twix?
God, I have so I don't get all messy, like some people take the caramel and then as
Yeah,
I'm a straight shooter. I just bite it and I try and have it slowly to really savor it and usually I love having a Twix when I'm watching Netflix, some trash on TV,
that's
reality TV.
amazing.
Yeah,
That's
that's my
amazing.
I put
But
lots of pleasures together at the same time, reading the Daily Mail whilst watching like Dubai Bling, whilst eating Twix was like triple pleasure.
that's
And
amazing because you do know that Amazon has this gift box. My colleague sent it me, and it was old school sweets from like the 80s and 90s. So it was like dib dabs and do you know is it chocolate twirl, the one that was like really long and you have to really pull it, and they
oh
do the what for chocolates as well.
yeah, no, I remember those. God, yeah, that is totally my generation.
The
So I'm
nostalgia. It still was amazing.
my
So
Christmas presents.
I have to ask you, let's talk about your work. So one of your specialities is destination marketing. How do you increase customer awareness of a particular destination so that they begin to think differently about that specific country or city?
But it's really interesting because actually there's a lot of touch points with a country or a destination that are interlinked. And it's really the sort of the interplay of culture, tourism, and trade and investment. And so I'll give you an example. For instance, if you take Malaysia and Thailand, they both have beautiful beaches, beautiful places of destination. But Thailand has more tourism from the UK than Malaysia. And the reason why is because actually there's lots of Thai restaurants in the UK that people, from the UK go and visit these Thai restaurants. They're familiar with the food. They meet often people from Thailand who are working in the restaurants. And so they have that familiarity touch points on their turf. And then when they are looking where they want to go on holiday, they think, oh, maybe I'll go to Thailand because I like the food. I've met Thai people in restaurants. It's not so unfamiliar. And then they go on holiday, and then that helps with the country's tourism after sampling the country's culture, which is in this case culinary. And then when they go to tourism, they're like, oh, this is quite nice. Maybe I can do some business here, or maybe I'll buy a business. So then so the culture goes into the tourism goes into the sort of trade and then investment. And of course, there's a lot of British expats who are like, you know what, I want to go and have a holiday home in Thailand. Or I want to go and live there. So you end up, people investing in buying properties, or looking in terms of doing business, especially during COVID, a lot of people went to countries like Thailand to go and work from there remotely. So it's really the interlinking of culture that feeds into tourism, which then feeds into trade, which then feeds into investment. So it's taking that sort of, macro perspective in promoting a destination.
So it's like a 360 sort of view.
Mm.
So like you said, Thai food is super popular in the UK and people love it. In situations like Nepal, a lot of, it's really difficult to find a good Nepalese restaurant in the UK. In a situation like that, have you been approached by countries where the culinary variety of restaurants or food or understanding of the culture in the UK is minimal, where they've asked you, look, we need your help. We want to increase tourism in our country, get people over there. Like, how does that work?
Well, it's quite interesting because, some countries obviously are very lucky that they had a diaspora that came to countries like the UK, set up restaurants, and then unwittingly sort of promoted the country because they had to. I think if you look at, for instance, the Bangladeshi community, they came over to the UK and they set up a lot of restaurants, but they didn't call it Bangladeshi food. They called it Indian food, and so Bangladesh lost out on that, and so therefore people who would go to India, let's go down to the Indian restaurant, it was actually a Bangladeshi restaurant, Bangladeshi chefs, Bangladeshi waiters. But then if you said to the people, oh, do you want to go to India or Bangladesh, they would think, I've got no familiarity touch points, not knowing that they're local, that they've been going to for the last 20 years is actually Bangladeshi Indian. So I think one thing is that how you frame, the diaspora actually frame their culture. There's been countries and places that have approached us that don't have that sort of diaspora in the UK. So what we do, and they don't have huge sort of budgets. So, some countries, that we've worked with, some of their strategies have been actually to subsidize, one of their sort of top chefs to go out to countries like the UK and the US and help them subsidize in setting up restaurants. If there isn't a budget to set up the restaurants, then, they'll do, for instance, like a sort of a culture week or, a food week, or food trucks, pop-ups. So it's a lot easier for countries that don't have this huge budgets or the diaspora to go and do it. And there's also some countries who inherently their food is not sort of it's not easy and palatable for another country. So the way that you work around it is you do a hybrid food. So you do fusion. So you take that country's food and you mix it with another culture. And then that way it becomes more palatable. So, for instance, it's become very fashionable, sort of, Peruvian food, which is a mixture of, sort of Japanese food mixes. And so
that's right.
Yes, when you have these, whereas if people just go and have hardcore Peruvian food that isn't mixed with sort of Japanese, it may not be palatable to a lot of people. So doing fusions also makes certain culinary foods from certain cultures more palatable to other cultures. If you do the fusion and you can still, storytell, because a lot of countries around the world have minority groups, and perhaps that intersection of their sort of cultures meeting in that country through food itself could be a great cultural export and a storytelling of how diverse the country is.
Definitely. When you mention Bangladeshi food, you're right. I'm actually from Loughborough, and there's a massive Bangladeshi community in Loughborough. But then you made me think, because a lot of the restaurants were Indian, taste of India. And I'm like, but you're Bangladeshi. But a lot of people don't know that, when you think of India, then you've got Pakistan and Bangladesh. If you're not from there, a lot of people won't know that, Bangladesh is famous for fish and using fenugreek. And if you want anything fish, they are the guys to go to. And then Pakistan is the meat, the biryanis, the saffron and the milk infused mutton. And it's just beautiful. And then India in general is more vegetarian. And it's a shame that, listening to you right now, Bangladeshi restaurants in Loughborough or wherever in the UK are not promoting their food, because it's so rich and it's different and it's just another take on Indian cuisine. And I think it should be promoted, but it's a shame.
Yeah, and it's the same in Africa, 54 countries, and people just lump it together. And, you take a country like Italy, and they've done a really good job of really promoting different foods of different regions. So they've really taken a regional approach to culinary storytelling. So, you go to the north and it's known for polenta and grissini and gianduja. You go to Bologna for spaghetti bolognese and focaccia. So they've done a really good job in people being much more aware of the different regions. And when you take huge land masses like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and the fact that we're kind of all lumped together as curry,
it's a shame.
Yeah, so I think I think that region needs to, really, I think they've got great potential for storytelling. Likewise, Africa, huge potential for culinary storytelling, untapped.
No, definitely, and it's curious to say that Italy's marketed themselves fantastically, and I think, I don't want to slate Spain, but living here, when people do come here, they just think, oh, I'm going to have patatas bravas and I want to have paella.
Yeah,
but actually, no, because, you know, and I'm hoping Spain does change this. You know, paella's from Valencia. Like, you do not have, if you want real paella, you go to Valencia. If you want to come to the south, it's the fried fish. It's yeah, like this stew that's made with, it's called plata saranton, I think, and it's made with every part of a pig. I've not touched it, but it's, you know, people know that. And then if you go to the north, it's about the beef. And, you know, in August you have ventresca, which is a part of tuna. And, you know, like, so people know you go here for certain things. And I don't think Spain has marketed themselves as well.
Yeah.
When you compare them to Italy, which is just next door. And it's a pity, but hopefully they'll do something about it, because yeah. But so, you know, when we think of, so, you know, you answered a bit of my question. Food and its origin has a significant role in this. And, you know, I think in the UK after World War II, there was massive migrations from different countries. And I think the thing about the UK is that we're very open to trying different foods and different cuisines. How, you know, for example, if it's a cuisine, you know, you mentioned fusion, Japanese, Peruvian's massive here in Spain. And how has it been difficult to introduce a cuisine where people have been a little standoffish in trying it? Has that ever come across in the work that you've done?
Yes, and I think the way that we countered it is we collaborated with other cuisines, other cultures, and another way of really doing it is you take. I remember we did some work in California, and we took a really famous Californian chef, and he was quite kind of, you know, he was young and he had tattoos and he was very cool, and, you know, and he was very Instagrammable and all of that, and you know, the food brand that we were working with, they were seen as quite sort of you know, a little bit sort of traditional, and they wanted to shake that image off. And it was actually, and then the way to do it is we got some food trucks, and we had the chef, you know, create the, you know, an incredible kind of like menu, you know, during the space of a couple of weeks, doing pop-ups at key places, and that kind of helps, because it's what we call in PR brand adjacency. So if you have a certain brand that's perceived in a certain way and it wants to be perceived in perhaps a different way, you then take, you know, a brand in that space and you find some sort of bridge, some sort of collaboration. So through the brand adjacency, the brand sort of transforms a bit and takes a little bit of the magic from the other brand. So yeah, so it's a little bit like that.
I think that's amazing. And then, like, when we think of food and gastronomic values, they are distinguishing assets in marketing places, what you've just mentioned.
Yeah.
As a means of shaping perceptions about a country, gastronomy represents and communicates values, not just about food, it's about their entire culture, you know, how you eat, how you sit, you know, like Japan, you sit on the floor and, you know, you don't put your feet on the table. In India, you eat with your hand because it's a thing about senses with the spices. And all of these are narratives and, you know, manifestations. Did you do this for the Basque country in Malaysia? Because they're two different countries, like, you know, one's a region in Spain and the one's a country. But can you tell me more about it? Because how are they different in terms of communities and values? Because it's food's one section, but everything else about that country or region is, there's more.
Yeah, when I was working on projects with Basque and Malaysia, it was, funny enough, focused on trade, but the conversations around it on how to attract was, you know, working with culture as ways to bring them in. But, you know, I would say with, you know, with a lot of countries around the world, there's definitely a growing awareness that you just don't go in straight with a hard sell of, you know, invest in our country, you know, here's our sectors. You actually start off with warming people up with the culture, and there's definitely a growing awareness that food is not just about taste, it is about history. It's about the plants, and it's about the plants and the food that is, you know, that is known in that region. So, you know, so when you sample a culture's food, you sample so much more than just taste. You know, as you said, you sample how they eat. What does food mean to them? How communal is the food experience? how much do they place emphasis upon food? They talk about food cultures. Some cultures, basically, say for instance, fast food. Food is just a functional. You just chug it
Yeah.
down, and it's fast, cheap. In other cultures, it's like you really take your time, just family around a table. There's rituals around food, so it's not just about the food per se. It's definitely about the rituals, and also quite interesting to like the ingredients. And the ingredients, tells you about the land, and it tells you about what grows out there and how that's shaped. I think as humans, we forget how much we're shaped by the flora and the fauna, and the plants and the animals around the land that we're sort of brought up in. And I think that things are changing now because you can get lots of stuff out of season from other countries, but we're moving back into a slightly slow food movement where people want to get ingredients locally. So I think that's going to be quite interesting. We're coming full circle, where before it used to be very fashionable that you live in one part of the world, but yet you had the money to bring in a very rare fruit from another part of the world totally out of season. But now it's kind of almost looked down upon because people are aware of the environmental impact. So what's going to probably change now is when people are in different countries, they're really going to go back to understanding that culture through the food, because the food will genuinely be from local sources. So that would be quite interesting, an interesting shift.
I think so, because I think, provenance has become massive. Carbon footprint, also another big thing that's happening. And I remember, when I used to work in the UK, you would have your lunch at your desk. But then when we explained that to people here in Spain, they were like, wait, you sit at your desk and you eat? And they were like, no, we, work, eating is away from your work, and you sit together and you have a conversation. And then I thought, yeah, maybe because our lifestyle is so different that we've lost a sense of eating, enjoyment around food. But I think now, because of other generations and because of climate change, we're slowly, like you said, it's turning back, and we're starting to appreciate provenance, sustainability, local food, and everything else that's coming along with it. And it got me thinking, because we travel, the world is global, you get to travel everywhere, and people think, oh, I want to go to Thailand and have Thai food, or I want to go to India and I'm going to have chapati, or whatever it is. And as much as you think, in general, people think that, oh, I'm having a variety of food. That's not actually the case, because in India, we used to have a massive variety of different types of wheat and crops. And we used to have a lot of millet, but then our diet became a lot of wheat oriented. So then you get these companies that are like, there's 4 major producers of wheat, and they will supply the entire world. So whether you think you're getting a variety of seasonal produce unique to that country, that's not the case, which has also led people with, discomfort in food or allergens in food, because our natural diet didn't contain that. So I think now there is a movement as well as to regain lost crops that were unique to the country, to also make more sustainable, instead of monoculture, we need to regain soil and grow our crops that's more natural to the environment that they live in. And there's a massive movement in that. And have you come across that in the work that you've done?
And that's fascinating. I mean, funny enough, my dad's from Kashmir, and so he has noticed that the plants and the trees when he was growing up as a boy in Kashmir have been replaced by other, sort of tree varieties that are, because of the locals make money from chopping down the trees, so they need to sort of change the tree species with ones that grow faster, and the wood has more value, but then it has an impact upon all of the sort of ecosystem. So he actually went around finding a lot of these sort of original tree species and and replanting them. So not so much for my work, but just for my family, I've sort of noticed that. But you've also got the added complexity lens of climate change. So where historically certain crops were indigenous to that region, and obviously indigenous is always subject to a certain timeline, where we are facing climate change, those indigenous crops may not actually be the right ones anymore, because they're shifts and changes, and the environment is changing. And so it's, it's going to be really interesting how they're going to tackle that aspect.
Definitely. And then
Where people have been very gung-ho, just going in, changing plant species, not understanding the delicate ecosystem that nature is, and not understanding the damage that we've been doing.
I think so. Because I did some research, about just in India about food culture, and there was a book by the Sultan of Mandu from the 14th century, and he did a collection of recipes that were of the terrain of India, but India as in the whole of Pakistan, the whole of every all the countries connected to us, and of recipes why the spices reflect worked well with that certain principal ingredient, and for health benefits, for sensuality, for love, for connection to the land and the seasons. And this is beautiful collection, and it made me realize, thinking, oh, that's why we do something, but we don't have that ingredient anymore. But why don't we have that ingredient anymore? And I think maybe as well, from what you're saying, it traces back to the delicate balance of climate change, and maybe they don't survive now in that in India or wherever they're from. And it's just a beautiful connection, and I'm doing some more research on that because I just think it's a fascinating story that dates back thousands of years. It's just it's quite stunning and rich in culture.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And also I think the issue is that some generations disregard the wisdom of earlier generations as being outdated, and sometimes there's a disconnect in passing wisdom through generations, and that's perhaps where we lose these sort of the reasons why the spices have been blended in a certain way.
Yeah, definitely. And so when we think about cultural, just a bit slightly off topic, but when we think about cultural diplomacy, this is one of the areas that you work in, but it facilitates a form of cultural exchange, such as sports, literature, music. Have you, as an expert or through Curzon PR, have you participated in any of the cultural exchange programs or international food awareness campaigns?
So we've worked on a lot of cultural programs between countries. We've done a lot of work. I mean, the first one that we ever worked on was actually Ukraine,
Wow.
2012, and it was quite interesting because Ukraine was trying to really assert its identity through culture when a lot of the world sort of saw them as interchangeable with Russia. And so a little bit like you have sort of India, and then the other countries around India, say Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, struggle to really form their identities when you've got a sort of a dominant player in the region. Likewise, Russia is a very dominant player, and so Ukraine and other sort of former Soviet Union countries struggled to build their identity, very much like what's happening in South Asia, because post-partition, all of a sudden these countries needed to have an identity, and you create an identity overnight when we were all one country. With and so the Soviet Union, funnily enough, has a very similar trajectory to South Asia, and post-partition, and of course post-partition, we've had sort of 70 odd years, whereas in the Soviet Union has been 30 years, so they're much they're much earlier on in their journey, but using and the issue with these countries is that they often are struggling to educate their people, to feed their people, to provide basic healthcare. And then when you say to these countries, oh, well, let's go and do a bit of a cultural jolly, they find it really hard to justify that spend when they're trying to deal with the basics in their country. And it's really that sort of pressure between short-term needs and building that long-term storytelling. And, when you say to people, well, instead of building another school, put some budget to cultural storytelling, it sounds so fluffy that the reaction is, it tends to be very negative. But actually, it does work to put yourself in the world stage, and it does attract the tourism and the trade, but you get the longer term economic benefits as opposed to the short term impact of the spending. So it's very hard for these countries, I think, because they are struggling to, to really portray themselves on the world stage. And then you've got countries like the US, and they are a master in cultural storytelling, through Hollywood, through McDonald's. Everyone flocks to, you ask anyone around the world, which country would you want to live in? A lot of them would turn around and say the US. And that kind of gives you a sense of that country soft power pull.
Yeah.
And the US has done, and they haven't just happened to, do it. They've had a planned strategy in promoting their culture.
It's curious to say that. Many years ago, I was teaching English, and there was a section. There's a book from the National Geographic, and they went to Bhutan. So Bhutan was also one of those little tiny countries that is lost with, the big space that is India. And I think there were 3 women left in that rural, country that she spoke the native language of Bhutan. But because of India, the common language, principal languages have become Hindi. And so what National Geographic did was attach recording, like tape recorders, to these women to save the dying language, but also save food, culture, and storytelling, and the essence of life that is native and unique to the people that are of Bhutan. And you just made me think of that with Ukraine. And it's just, there are other countries that are in a similar situation to what you've just described that are also trying to make their way and establish some sort of presence in this world. And it's hard. It's
really hard because, you look at Africa, 54 countries, the way they carved up Africa wasn't along ethnic tribal lines. And so you have countries in Africa that actually have, multiple different tribes, and part of the tribes are in one country and the other and the other. So how do they cobble together like a national story? It's really hard for countries whose borders are artificial, shall we say, in the sense that it's not sort of neatly around a certain ethnicity or tribe. And then what's also fascinating is countries like the UK and the US that have very diverse populations, rather than homogenous populations, and how are they telling their story using culture, and obviously promoting diversity as an ideal goes some way towards it. But it's definitely, a very fascinating time where countries are realizing that storytelling is not just for consumer goods. It's for countries, it's for nations. It's not only for internal social cohesion that everyone feels part of the story of a country story, but it's also external to bring in the tourism and bring in the trade and the investment.
No, definitely. And communication in terms of this, communication is your passion, and it's a major part of your work. And your work is highly sought after by government officials and broadcasters and newspapers. And honestly, you as a person, I think you are pulverizing the glass ceiling for your work, because the work that you've been involved with countries and, the government in the UK and just other brands and chefs, you've really put your mark on it.
Well, I'm inspired. To just say, I'm really inspired by the people that I've worked with. And there's so many people out there who are like me, who are very open to the other, because you get different personalities. Some people don't like change and difference, and other people like myself love other cultures. And there's so many like-minded people around the world that, like me, want to build these bridges. So I feel like I'm part of an international community that want to really create a community around the world, as opposed to just fragmented, countries.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's quite beautiful, the work that you are doing in connecting, in creating these sort of global partnerships. But how has your journey been so far? Like, have you had some trials and tribulations, or or has it been smooth sailing? Like, please tell me some more.
It's been quite hard. Like overall, I love what I do. I feel it's my purpose. My parents came from Pakistan. I live in the UK. I'm married to an Italian. My friends are all diverse around the world. So I feel that my DNA is about sort of, bringing people together
Mm.
and and building bridges across countries and cultures and people, and that's what I stand for. But it has been hard because my first client was Ukraine, my second client was Russia. Obviously, Russia is persona non grata now, and so and I sort of get trolled, on Twitter saying, "Oh my God, you work for the Russian government," and they kind of make out that I was Putin's personal private secretary sending
Oh
out
my
press.
goodness.
And
Okay.
I was like, yeah, when Russia and the UK were actually had very positive dialogue, I was promoting Russian culture in the UK.
Mm.
Um, and you get accused of doing all sorts. And then I was, and I went to go and work also in Bahrain. I was very much sort of, criticized for that. I've worked in a lot of countries, from countries that are non-contentious, so we say, like
Mm.
Canada, like Finland, like Japan, like South Korea, and other countries, and I get a lot of sort of trolling around the countries that I work with on culture, and it's really hard because I don't believe in excluding entire countries because you don't like one aspect of their foreign policy. Because also every nation needs to look in the mirror, and perhaps our foreign policy in the UK, there may be elements of it historically or currently that may not quite be right.
Mm.
Like, the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, and the way that we manage those. So I think there's a huge air of hypocrisy.
Mm.
You know, you can only work for these countries and you can't work for those because we don't like their foreign policy at one point in their history, but not looking at ourselves. So there's a lack of self-awareness, I think, sometimes with nations,
Mm.
with people. And there's a huge sort of, wanting to silence countries, which I just don't like that. I mean, of course, if, there's a rogue nation and like what's happening with Russia at the moment, I mean, us as an agency have said we will not work at all with
Yeah.
anyone to the government because of what they're doing now. And But it's that sort of sense of shaming voices and silencing voices, and there are certain countries at certain times that I believe communicators shouldn't work for, because you don't want to further them. But it's becomes a very tricky terrain to manage because you always want to make sure that every project that you work on has a positive impact and you're not
Mm.
enabling, you know, bad people doing bad things. And so it's a lot more complex, and that's something that I've always been very conscious and aware of, in sort of walking that fine line.
And so, if there was one piece of advice you'd give to someone starting out in your career, what would it be?
Gosh, I would say that to just be um, just be aware that if you go and start working in the international space, um, and you work at a certain level, there'll be certain people who'll come after you. And I think that, and especially as a woman, there's been some jobs I've been sort of given and I haven't gone because I was sort of worried about personal safety. I'm also a mother. And so I think, the issue is that when you work in the sort of government space and the international space, and and the geopolitics is switching and changing. Like 5 years ago, we were best buddies with China, and now it's like persona non grata, don't want to work with you anymore. So you've got to constantly be aware of the geopolitical shifts, the changes in sentiment, and sort of ensure that you pivot accordingly. So I think to be highly aware that when you work on these levels, you will have to face, people who do not like the idea of building bridges, and they prefer the idea of silencing and shaming nations as opposed to dialogue. And it's a tricky path for those who believe in uniting voices.
No, definitely. I think so. Many years ago, I worked for the European Union Intellectual Property Office, and nothing to do with nations as such, but yeah, kind of, but none. It's like it's in a between thing.
Yeah.
And I did a lot of work in Brussels, and one thing I found was when we are creating these united documents that, you know, you have to implement in all these countries in Europe, and then soon it goes international. A lot of shaming does happen. So like you said, as a woman as well, it's really hard, and, you know, having to tiptoe and be respectful, and, you know, you have to, you know, I worked with lawyers from around different countries in Europe, and creating these documents and being, you know, holding these meetings together. At times I wanted to like just curl up, because you're dealing with different, you know, strong characters that are like, well, you know, our national, like our documents won't work here because of this, and I want to write this, and Anisha, you can't do it like. It was just a hard time. And, you know, you're thinking as well, like building bridges, and a lot of people just want separation, so it's really hard to implement something that will benefit the country long term. And, you know, how will they deal with it? So thankfully my projects are implemented in the EU, but in the grand scheme of things, at times I honestly thought about my mental health, because it was a lot of pressure from different governing bodies in Europe on me going, we want to change this, and this is not going to happen, and it's tough to maintain sane, you know, breathe and
can be very
not
toxic.
be.
Yeah, it can be very toxic. And I think whenever there's power dynamics involved, that just basically throws up all sorts of characters and agendas. And sometimes you feel like you're walking, you know, in a full of landmines, and you've got to constantly sort of, you know, and you get to a point where you just can't make everybody happy, and you've got to that, and you've just got to follow your heart, your purpose, your values, and, you know,
It's true. It's so hard sometimes. I mean, you look back, you're like, oh, it's a wonderful lesson, but in the moment you're like, it was a minefield. It really was. And so, you know, continuing on in relationships, as part of the Paris Agreement, the world has committed to a zero net path by 2050. In recent years, many companies have made bold commitments to change the way they do their business. However, it's not always clear how they will succeed. For example, food companies are now shifting towards a shorter supply chain in terms of, you know, carbon footprint and all of that. But how have you worked with leaders to develop a coherent story to demonstrate their companies or countries' adaptability to this new world? Sorry, I got stuttered over my words.
Well, you know, one of the things that we're taught in the PR industry is, you know, is authenticity, and the importance of, you know, not going down the greenwashing route. You know, you'll always have rogue PRs who do things and give us a bad reputation, but by and large, the best PR, you know, the best PR sort of approach is always you take the truth and you amplify the truth, and because the minute you deviate from truth, you lose trust with your stakeholders, and to build trust is incredibly hard, and you have to protect those reservoirs of trust that you have in, you know, in your stakeholders, by always ensuring that, you know, the information that you're giving. And I think people are generally quite forgiving, and I think if, you know, a company or a country says, you know, we know that we are not where we want to be, but our intent is there, and we're going to marry our intentionality with action and resource, and this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to measure it, this is how we're going to report it to you. And they don't, and if they screw up, they say, we didn't, you know, we're disappointed with our results, you know, and this is why we didn't meet our targets, and this is what we're going to do to counter it. And I think if you take people along on that journey, you know, showing your vulnerability and being authentic, I think, you know, I think stakeholders are forgiving. I think where things break down is when people become disingenuous with the truth, and they start greenwashing, and they start saying how wonderful they are as a country or a company or a person. You know, I think that we all understand the human condition. We all understand that we're all fallible, and the importance is, you know, regular communication, making it really clear what the intent is and what the process is, and that sort of transparent reporting. And I think you build so much trust when you say to your stakeholders, we didn't make our target and we're disappointed, and we've reviewed why, and these are the reasons why, and these are how we're going to mitigate that for our next, reporting quarter. So that's really important, and it's transformative. But it's usually, often people don't go down that route because out of fear of being criticised, and then they end up being criticised even more because they've kind of played around with sort of the truth and semantics. But it's we always counsel transparency, because transparency is what builds trust, and trust is what builds relational capital with stakeholders.
Definitely. So, this, I think this also applies for corporations and governments.
Yeah.
So let's take like food policy. So since leaving the EU, there's still so many grey areas, I'd say. How do you communicate best practices for managing media relationships in terms of the situation, or managing market expectations in terms of these sort of situations?
I think it's it's about I think sometimes, unfortunately, certain journalists may have a certain story in mind, and therefore may have a certain agenda in mind, and no matter how transparent and open you are, they may just take a piece of your company or your country and build a narrative around that isn't really the whole truth. And I think sometimes there's nothing you can do about that, really. But I think one way to counter that is when people kind of misshape your truth, is by having a very strong sort of direct to public communications channels, be it websites, blogs, podcasts, social media, and really ensuring that the content that goes out there is engaging and is authentic and is trusted information, so that you can counter any sort of narratives that are seeking to undermine. But that you can only do that if you are brave with your content on these channels, and you tackle difficult situations and head on with transparency. So it really goes back to building trust, and you can only build trust through transparency. And transparency is about being vulnerable and showing what you've done that's great and what you've done that's not so great, coupled with a self-awareness around it and a mitigation strategy.
So when we consider the barriers that you've had to overcome in this sort of situations, do you think, it's a bit of a personal question, but do you think, when we think of cultural diversity and growth, do you think as a woman it's been harder in terms of communicating this and managing these media relationships? Or do people take you, in the beginning, do people take you seriously? Because sometimes there is this whole thing of gender equality.
Yeah, I think, funny enough, I was at an event a couple of nights ago, and somebody said to me, I really tried to get you on the pitch list for this particular, very big company. And it was, and they said, and unfortunately, the feedback we got is that you can't get on the list, even though you're really perfectly suited for this particular job, because of your ethnic background. Now, but what's shocking is the person who didn't want me on the pitch list, because of my ethnic background, was of the same ethnic background as me.
So
yeah,
I'm a bit speechless.
yeah. And I was like intrigued. I was like, really? And I said, thank you so much for telling me. Number one, this is this person had left the company, so therefore told me. And I said, I don't understand. And she said, because the thinking is that they want to influence journalists in the UK and and other sort of government stakeholders, and the thought is that you as an ethnic minority won't have that ability to influence. So it was, and so what's quite interesting is discrimination doesn't just come from different ethnic groups, it can come from within ethnic groups. But saying that, I've had a hugely supportive South Asian community that have always batted for me, actually. So that's the first time I've ever heard of somebody from the same ethnic background as me discriminating against me. I've actually never heard that before, and I've always had a wonderful experience with people from the same community as me. But that was quite shocking, and I think it wasn't, and I think it showed how I think it kind of echoed a lot of sort of fear that people have, that ethnic minorities in this country don't actually have influence. And I think, well, look at our Prime Minister.
Yeah.
What more do you want? And I think there is, probably a sense of maybe that's tokenism, or I don't know. I mean, I think that the UK actually is a wonderful society. I think we've got our problems, and I think definitely there's sexism, there's racism, there's
Yeah.
also class issues as well, which is massive. And I think that we all carry with us privileges, and we all carry with us, areas that we can be discriminated against, and it isn't as cut through as just gender
No.
and I think, yes, I'm a woman and I'm an ethnic minority, but also my parents came from a middle class background. They were entrepreneurs. I had quite a middle class, so upbringing. I went to state schools and private schools. I feel privileged in the way that I run a business, but my grandfather ran businesses. My parents both ran businesses. My aunties, even in Pakistan, all ran businesses. So I had strong role models. I really respect people who haven't had that, and who were the first to go to university in their family, were the first to set up businesses. I think they are the role models, and I think they are the ones who are the game changers. Someone like me, I've aped what I've seen around me. So, every ethnic minority woman has a different journey, and I came from a relatively privileged background. So I wasn't really a game changer. I did exactly what my aunts, my grandparents, and my parents did by running businesses and having that confidence. But someone who's a child of a bus driver like Sadiq Khan or Sajid Javed, I think, wow,
No,
those
definitely.
I respect, who didn't have those role models.
No, definitely. I think that, I find it quite curious. Like, this is the first time you've experienced this sort of relation, or this sort of I wouldn't even say it's discrimination, but this sort of
I was
it
floored when I heard.
I've grown up with it, and it's really curious. I used to get bullied, but within the Indian community, and it was so for me, I've grown up with it.
Oh,
But
wow.
so so for me, it's I never got bullied by any of my friends or anyone that wasn't from the ethnic minority that I was in. So I think that's absolutely fascinating, because I think school can be a terrible time for children, but wow, you really surprised me, really, really. But my last question to you, you know, is the one leading on from this, is the one life lesson your job has taught you that you would give to yourself looking back?
Yeah. So, gosh, I think that it sounds so like on trend, really, but I would say looking back, I was very I was never kind to myself. And I think that I had very poor mental health over the years, especially when I was a young mum running a business. At some point, I had an office in Dubai and New York as well as London. And I was very much sort of like, seeking external validation. And in order, and at the expense, and it wasn't ego driven, it was more sort of low self esteem that I had. And I was just constantly, working nonstop 7 days a week, and it then impacted my mental health. And it took me a very long time to realize, to be self-aware of why was I pursuing, all of this, sort of industry sort of claim or whatever, or working with interesting clients. And a lot of it came from a lack within. And it took me, God, it's taken me about 25 years in my career to realize that, I need balance in my life, and questioning why I am ambitious, and why I want to do things, and realizing that sometimes it comes from a poverty within. So what I've kind of learned is, through meditation, through self-awareness, through, really understanding my motivations, I've learned to have a bit more balance in my life. And therefore I'm a much happier person than I used to be. So
Mm,
sometimes I would, in the past, I don't receive an award and everyone would be like, congratulations. And I felt utterly miserable and empty and broken inside.
yeah.
Um, and, but now it's like a day goes by, and I haven't done anything amazing particularly, but I feel wonderful inside. So I think it's just about questioning life, and kind of like motivations, and purpose, and taking time to be kind to yourself. Life isn't a race with other people. It's just about a journey with yourself, really.
I think that's absolutely stunning, like so beautifully said. And on that note, I just want to say, Farzana, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure having you, and I've learnt so much about the journey you've embarked on. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I've learned an awful lot from you, and I love the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.